This audiobook is brought to you by the Paladin Learn History app. Hi guys, tonight we are going somewhere cold, not uncomfortable cold, not the kind of cold where you pull your jacket a little tighter and think about turning the heating up when you get home. We are talking about the kind of cold that gets inside the walls and stays there. The kind of cold that forms a thin skin of ice across the water in your basin overnight. The kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air like smoke even when you are standing 3 feet from the largest fire in the room. We are going to a medieval castle, and we are going to spend the night. Before you get too comfortable where you are right now, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy what we do here, and subscribe if you want more of these long, slow journeys through history. And tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the weather is like outside your window. I love knowing where these stories travel to. Now, dim the lights if you can. Let your shoulders drop. And come with me. You smell it first. That is always how it starts. Wood smoke. Not the clean, pleasant kind from a garden bonfire on a still autumn evening. This is the accumulated smell of months of burning, the kind that has worked its way into every piece of fabric in every room, into the tapestries and the bed curtains and the clothing hanging on the pegs by the door. It sits in the air so constantly that the people who live here stopped noticing it long ago. But you notice it because you are arriving, and arriving always makes you notice things that familiarity has long since erased. Underneath the smoke there is something else. Damp stone. The mineral smell of walls that have never fully dried out, that hold moisture in their depths year-round and release it slowly into the rooms they surround. And under that, if you breathe carefully enough, something warmer. Beeswax from the candles, the faint sweetness of hay from the rushes on the floor, and from somewhere further away, from the direction of the kitchen range, the ghost of roasted meat from hours ago, still clinging to the air. You are inside a medieval castle on a winter night, and this is what it smells like. This is what home smelled like for thousands of people across hundreds of years. The question tonight is simple. How did they survive it? Let us start with the building itself, because everything begins there. A medieval castle was not designed to be warm. If you remember nothing else from tonight, remember that. Every single feature of the architecture that made these buildings so impressive, the massive walls, the narrow windows, the soaring ceilings, the stone staircases spiraling upward through the thickness of the towers, every one of those features worked directly against the comfort of the people living inside them. The walls could be 12, 15, sometimes 20 feet thick at the base of the main tower. They were solid limestone or sandstone or flint, depending on what the local quarries provided, laid in lime mortar by skilled masons and built to last for centuries. They achieved that purpose admirably. You can still see them today, those walls, standing largely as they were built, having outlasted the people who raised them by 600 or 700 years. What those walls could not do was keep the people inside them warm. Stone has a quality that medieval builders understood practically even if they lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe it. It takes enormous amounts of time and energy to warm up, and in the deep cold of a northern European winter, those walls chilled down to temperatures barely distinguishable from the outside air, and no amount of fire burning in a hearth across the room could meaningfully change what was happening 3 feet from the flames. The stone simply absorbed the heat, drank it in, gave back cold. The windows made it worse. In the earlier centuries of castle building, most windows were narrow slots fitted with wooden shutters, designed for defense first and light second, and warmth not at all. Even in the later medieval period, when glass windows had become more common in the principal chambers of wealthy households, the glass was thick and distorted, set in small pieces within lead frames that conducted cold directly into the room. On a winter night with the shutters drawn, a medieval castle chamber was dark in a way that modern people rarely experience, and cold in a way that most of us have never had to manage. The ceilings were high. This mattered enormously because heat rises, and in a tall room, all the warmth produced by the fire and by the candles and by the bodies of the people in the space collected far above anyone's head, hovering useless near the rafters, while the residents huddled below in air that stayed stubbornly cold. And the staircases, those elegant stone spirals cut into the thickness of the walls, were perfect channels for cold air to travel upward from the damp lower levels into the sleeping chambers above. Every time you opened a door at the bottom of a staircase, you sent a column of cold air climbing through the building. Every time you opened a door at the top, you felt it arrive. This was the environment. This is what people were managing every single winter night for centuries. And they did manage it. They managed it with considerable ingenuity, with practical intelligence accumulated across generations, and with a set of solutions that were far more systematic and sophisticated than the simple image of huddling under furs would suggest. The first solution was the room itself. Not all rooms in a medieval castle were equally cold, and the people who lived in these buildings knew the thermal map of their home with the precision that comes from long experience. They knew which chamber held warmth longest after the fire was banked. They knew which corridor was a wind tunnel regardless of the weather outside. They knew which direction each window faced and what that meant for the quality of light and warmth at different times of day. The solar, a word that comes from the Latin for sun, was typically the warmest room in the residential range. It was usually positioned on an upper floor, with windows arranged to capture whatever winter sunlight was available, which in Northern Europe was limited but still worth pursuing. The walls of a south-facing upper chamber, having absorbed the sun's heat during the day and having a fireplace burning within, retained some of that warmth into the evening. Not much by our standards, enough to matter enormously by theirs. The Great Hall was the largest communal space and the most actively heated, with its enormous fireplace burning through the day and into the evening. But it was also the hardest to keep warm because the volume of air was simply too great. The fire created a zone of tolerable temperature in its immediate vicinity, and the further you moved from it, the colder the air became. The high table at a medieval feast was positioned where it was partly for reasons of prestige and partly because that was where the warmth was. The least senior members of the household sat furthest from the fire. This was understood by everyone. Below the hall, in the lower levels and undercrofts, the cold was worst. These spaces were partly below ground, surrounded by earth that was permanently damp, and they were used for storage rather than sleeping whenever that was possible. The kitchen was the exception to every rule. The kitchen fireplace burned almost continuously through the winter, maintaining temperatures for cooking that were genuinely warm by any standard. Kitchen servants who slept near the ovens were sleeping in the warmest spot in the entire establishment. Several accounts from the period mention people choosing to sleep on the kitchen floor in cold weather rather than in their assigned chambers, not as a sign of hardship, but as a simple practical decision. The floor of a warm kitchen beat the bed of a cold chamber on the nights when the cold was at its worst. The tapestries came next, and they were not primarily decorative. When a medieval castle household hung tapestries against the stone walls of their chambers, they were doing something that looks like interior decoration and is actually thermal engineering. A tapestry hung against a cold stone wall creates an air gap between the fabric and the surface behind it. That trapped air insulates. It prevents the cold of the wall from radiating directly into the room. In a chamber where every surface was otherwise a source of cold, this made a difference that the residents could feel. The wealthiest households had multiple sets of tapestries and moved them between rooms depending on which spaces were currently occupied. When a great lord travelled between his estates, which happened regularly, the tapestries went with him packed carefully in wooden chests. They were not left behind as fixed decoration. They were part of the essential mobile infrastructure of livable warmth, as important to the travelling household as the beds and the kitchen equipment. Wooden panelling served the same function lower on the walls. Oak boards fitted against the stone, sometimes carved with decorative patterns, always practical in their effect. Wood is a far poorer conductor of cold than stone. Touch a stone wall in winter, and your hand chills immediately. Touch an oak-panelled wall, and it is merely cool. The difference is significant when you are spending 16 hours in a space, and the temperature is already marginal. The floors were covered with rushes, cut from riverbanks and spread thick across the stone. the rushes compressed underfoot to form a mat of fibrous material that insulated the floor surface and held within its structure pockets of trapped air. They accumulated debris over time and were periodically cleared and replaced with fresh material, sometimes with dried herbs mixed in to improve the smell, sometimes with aromatic plants believed to have protective properties against illness. They were not hygienic by our standards, they were warm by any standard, and warmth was what mattered. Now the bed. If there is a single object that represents medieval humanity's response to the problem of sleeping in a cold stone building, it is the four-poster bed with its wooden canopy and its heavy curtains. This piece of furniture is often described in terms of its grandeur, its carved posts, its expensive hangings, its visible expression of wealth and status. All of that is real, but the grandeur was a secondary consideration. The primary consideration was thermal survival. Think about what a bed with fully drawn curtains actually is. It is a tent. It is a small enclosed space within which the heat produced by a sleeping human body cannot circulate away into the cold room. The curtains block drafts from reaching the sleeping surface. They trap the warmth of your breath, which carries genuine heat. They create a microclimate, a bubble of modified air that is measurably warmer than the surrounding chamber, and they maintain that microclimate through the night as long as the curtains stay closed. Medieval households built their beds with this function as the central design consideration. The curtains were heavy. They were made of thick wool or wool-lined linen in ordinary households, of silk lined with fur in the grandest. They were cut to reach from the canopy frame all the way to the floor with no gaps where cold air could infiltrate from below. The canopy was solid, a genuine roof for the sleeping space rather than merely a frame, positioned close enough to the sleeper to catch and hold the warmth rising from the bed. The bed frame was elevated from the floor. This served several purposes simultaneously. It removed the sleeper from direct contact with cold stone or damp rushes. It positioned the sleeping surface above the coldest layer of air in the room, which pooled at floor level. And it placed the sleeping body in the airspace where the fireplace had most effect, because even the limited warmth produced by a banking fire travelled somewhat horizontally through the room before rising to the ceiling. The mattress underneath the sleeper was typically layered, a base of straw or coarser material, a feather mattress above that, sometimes a third layer of wool padding. The feather mattress was the luxury element, requiring geese or ducks in significant numbers and skilled labor to construct and maintain. Feathers trap air between their structures the way modern downfilling does, and the insulating effect of a well-stuffed feather mattress was considerable. These objects appeared in wills, were bequeathed to specific heirs, and were carried between estates when households travelled. They were among the most valuable portable possessions a medieval household owned. Above the mattress came the blankets, and here the approach was layered with the deliberateness of a system rather than the casualness of habit. Linen sheets first, smooth against the skin and effective at wicking moisture. Woolen blankets above that, multiple layers, each one dense and heavy, pressing down with a weight that people described in terms of reassurance rather than discomfort. The weight was evidence of warmth, and above everything in the grandest beds, a coverlet of fur or richly woven cloth, both the visible expression of status and the outermost layer of an insulating system. The curtains drawn, the canopy sealed, the blankets layered. The curtained space within a well-appointed great bed could be 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the surrounding chamber. On a night when the room had dropped to near freezing, which in a northern castle in January was not unusual, that difference was the difference between rest and suffering. Now let us talk about what you are wearing. In the medieval castle you dressed for bed, not down, up. The nightshirt was the foundation, typically linen, cut long to the ankles, with long sleeves and a fitted neck. Linen cools at first contact but warms quickly against the skin, and it wicks moisture effectively, which matters through a night of moderate warmth within the curtained bed. Over the nightshirt in cold weather came additional layers, a wool tunic, a gown of heavy cloth. Whatever was necessary to add insulation to the body before it climbed into the bed and began the long process of warming the thermal environment within the curtains. The sleeping cap is the detail that modern people find most charming and most foreign. The nightcap, tied under the chin, covering the ears, fitting snugly around the skull, was worn by virtually everyone who slept in cold conditions in the medieval period. It was worn by lords and servants, by men and women, by adults and children. The King of England slept with his head covered. The kitchen boy in the lowest chamber of the tower slept with his head covered or with a corner of his blanket pulled over it if he had no cap. The reason is straightforward once you understand it. The head loses heat more rapidly than almost any other part of the body because the brain requires a constant supply of warm blood and the blood vessels of the scalp are always close to the surface. Without insulation over the skull, warmth bleeds away into the surrounding air throughout the night. With even a light fabric cap, the rate of that loss drops significantly. The sleeping cap was not a piece of comic medieval fashion. It was a piece of thermal technology as important to the medieval sleeper as the bed curtains around them. The feet were the other great vulnerability, and they were addressed with wool stockings worn to bed, with additional cloth wrappings around the ankles, and with heated objects placed at the foot of the bed before the sleeper got in. The bed warmer, that shallow copper pan on a long wooden handle, was filled with hot coals from the fireplace and passed carefully back and forth between the sheets to preheat the sleeping surface. A well-used bed warmer raised the temperature of the linen significantly before the sleeper got in, making the first moments in bed something other than shocking. The technique required care, too long in one position and the sheets scorched, too fast and the fabric never warmed properly. Medieval household accounts sometimes record expenditure on replacement linen, and the implication is occasionally explicit. Someone was careless with the bed warmer again. Households without copper bed warmers used smooth stones heated at the edge of the fire, wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed. A heated stone retains warmth for hours, releasing it slowly into the surrounding fabric. The wrapping prevented scorching and slowed the rate of heat loss. It was simple. It worked. It was used across the full social range of medieval domestic life, from modest farmhouses to noble chambers, wherever a warm stone and a piece of cloth were available. We need to be honest about the fireplaces now, because the image most people carry of them is considerably more optimistic than the medieval reality. The great fireplace of a castle hall was impressive, opening 8 or 10 feet wide, deep enough to stand inside, fitted with iron supports for logs the size of small trees. When burning at full capacity with well-seasoned hardwood, it produced enormous amounts of heat. The problem was where that heat went. The chimney flue of a medieval castle fireplace was large, necessarily large, because the smoke from a big fire needed a correspondingly generous channel to escape through. And along with that smoke went a substantial proportion of the heat. The early medieval builders who developed the wall fireplace as an improvement over the central hearth had not yet developed the understanding of draft dynamics that would eventually allow more efficient flue designs. The result was that a castle fireplace was genuinely impressive as a spectacle and genuinely limited as a heating system. The radiant heat that projected forward from the fire was real and useful. Stand 2 feet away and you were too hot. Stand 6 feet away and you were comfortable. Stand 10 feet away and you were cold again. Stand at the far end of a 70-foot great hall and you might as well have been outdoors. Medieval people understood this geometry instinctively. They positioned themselves in relation to fires with the precision of long experience. They knew exactly where the useful warmth ended and the cold began. They moved through that gradient constantly, seeking the warm zones when they needed them and accepting the cold zones when there was no alternative. Their relationship with heat in an interior space was more active and more conscious than ours, because the heat was never guaranteed and never universal. Banking the fire for the night was a precise art. You did not let it go out if you could help it. A completely dead fire in the depths of a cold winter night was a genuine problem, because restarting it from scratch in the morning took time and effort that a household trying to begin its day did not want to spend. Instead, the remaining logs were arranged to burn as slowly as possible, covered with ash to reduce the oxygen supply, left to smoulder rather than to blaze. In some households there were servants whose primary winter function was to sleep beside the fire, or near it, waking periodically through the night to add fuel and ensure the embers stayed alive. This was not a prestigious position. It was an essential one. The households that took it seriously were the households whose winter mornings were least miserable. The smoke was the unavoidable price of all of this. There was no escaping it. A wood fire in a stone room produces smoke, and even with a well-designed chimney, some portion of that smoke found its way back into the room it was supposed to be evacuating. On days when the wind pushed back down the flue instead of drawing the smoke upward, the situation became genuinely difficult. The chamber filled with a low haze that stung the eyes and caught in the throat and settled into every piece of fabric in the room. Medieval castle residents breathed wood smoke. They breathed it every day of every winter, in quantities that would be unacceptable by any modern health standard. They breathed it in their sleep, lying behind drawn curtains while the embers slowly declined and the smoke drifted through the gaps that no curtain ever fully sealed. The adaptation was the adaptation that human beings always make to chronic environmental conditions. They accepted it as normal. They stopped noticing it. The smell of smoke was the smell of warmth, and warmth was what mattered. When visitors complained about the smokiness of a castle, they identified themselves as outsiders. The people who had lived there for years simply looked at them with mild incomprehension. Now, the other bodies in the room. The most reliable and consistent source of warmth in a medieval castle was not the fireplace. It was another human being. A healthy adult human body produces approximately 80 watts of heat continuously as a byproduct of staying alive. When two bodies share a confined space, each one benefits from the heat produced by the other. When several bodies share that space, the effect compounds. The total warmth available to the group is greater than any individual could generate alone, and the rate at which that warmth disperses into the surrounding cold is lower because each person is insulated on at least one side by another warm body rather than by air. Medieval castle residents slept together. The arrangements were carefully calibrated to social hierarchy, but the underlying principle was thermal as much as conventional. The lord and his lady shared the great bed. Ladies in waiting slept in the same chamber on pallets near the fire. Servants whose duties required them to be available through the night slept at the foot of the bed or across the threshold of the door. Children slept near their parents or their nurses. None of this was incidental. All of it was understood, at least partly, in terms of warmth. The dogs deserve a specific mention. The small breeds, the lapdogs that wealthy women favoured as companions, were permitted in the sleeping chambers and sometimes in the bed itself. They were clean by medieval standards, docile and warm. A small dog sleeping at the feet of a person in bed provided sustained warmth through the contact of its body, a self-regulating heat source that required no fuel and produced no smoke and asked for nothing more than proximity and occasional affection. The larger hunting dogs were generally kept out of the principal chambers, but in the lower parts of the castle, in the barracks and the service rooms and the outbuildings, the warmth of animals was accessed more directly. People slept in stables and byres in the coldest weather, not as a sign of degradation, but as a practical choice. Cattle and horses produce enormous quantities of heat. A byre full of cows in winter is genuinely warm, significantly warmer than any unheated stone room. The straw is dry, the roof is solid, the animals are indifferent to the presence of sleeping humans. Several accounts from the period treat this arrangement as entirely unremarkable, which is itself telling. What they ate and drank before sleep mattered more than most modern accounts acknowledge. Digestion produces heat. This is metabolic heat generated by the biochemical process of breaking down food, and it is real and measurable. A person who has recently eaten a substantial meal is genuinely warmer for several hours afterward than one who is fasting. Medieval people did not have the scientific vocabulary to explain this mechanism, but they understood the effect through long direct experience, and they used it. The evening drink was a feature of medieval castle life across a wide range of social levels. Mulled wine with honey and spices for those who could afford it. Hot ale for those who could not. Both provided calories that translated into metabolic warmth. Both raised the body's core temperature slightly before sleep. Both made the first hour inside the cold bed more manageable. The spices that went into the mulled wine were not purely flavoring. Cinnamon and ginger and cloves have genuine physiological effects, some of them vasodilatory, meaning they increase blood flow to the extremities and produce the sensation of spreading warmth through the body. Medieval physicians who recommended spiced wine before sleep were working within a theoretical framework we now know to be incorrect. The theory of the four humours and their qualities of heat and cold and moisture and dryness. But the practical recommendation they arrived at through that framework was empirically sound. Warm spiced wine before bed in a cold building helps. We can now explain why. They just knew that it did. Food before sleep served the same function. The body needed fuel to maintain its temperature through a long, cold night, and a person who went to bed adequately fed was physiologically better equipped for that task than one who was hungry. Hunger reduces metabolic rate. A cold and hungry person in a medieval castle chamber was at genuine risk in a way that a well-fed person in the same circumstances was not. The pre-sleep meal was not a luxury, it was part of the survival system. Here is something about the night itself that most people do not know, and that changes the picture entirely. Medieval people did not sleep through the night in the way that most people in modern industrialized societies expect to. The 8-hour continuous sleep that we treat as the biological norm is not, in fact, particularly old. It is a product of artificial lighting and industrial work schedules and the cultural expectations that grew up around them. It is, historically speaking, recent. The pattern that emerges from medieval records across a wide range of sources, medical texts, household accounts, personal letters, literary works, monastery chronicles, is a divided one. 2 periods of sleep separated by a period of wakefulness. The first sleep began at bedtime, typically sometime in the hours following the evening meal and the final prayers of the day. It lasted roughly 4 hours, sometimes a little less, sometimes more. Then came the waking interval, sometimes called the watch, lasting an hour or two. Then the second sleep, continuing until morning. This was not described as a problem. It was simply how nights worked. The interval between the 2 sleeps had its own character and its own appropriate activities. People prayed. The night office of the medieval church was structured around this natural waking period, and in monasteries the bell rang to call the monks from their beds at precisely this time. In castles and manor houses, the same interval was used for prayer, for tending the fire, for quiet conversation, for reflection of the kind that the medieval mind associated with the space between waking and sleeping. The fire tending was the most practical function of the waking interval. In a cold castle chamber where the fire had been banking for 4 hours, the embers needed attention. Someone had to get up, cross the cold floor, add fuel, coax the fire back toward active burning, and ensure that the second half of the night would be as warm as the first half could be managed. The natural waking that occurred at the midpoint of the night was, in practical terms, perfectly timed for this task. In the servants' quarters and in the lower chambers, the interval was used for checking on animals, for carrying out small tasks that the busyness of the day had left undone, for the quiet sociability that developed between people sharing a cold, dark night in a confined space. The medieval night was not simply an absence of day, it was a time with its own rhythm and its own particular quality of experience. The herbs and the charms and the rituals of bedtime deserve their own moment, because they were not separate from the practical strategies of warmth management. In the medieval mind, they were part of the same project. Sprigs of rosemary tucked into the rushes, lavender mixed into the bedding material, dried herbs hung above the sleeping space. These served multiple purposes simultaneously. They discouraged insects, which were a genuine problem in medieval bedding. They improved the smell of spaces that accumulated smoke and human occupation and damp and all the other odors of medieval life. And they were believed to have protective properties to ward off illness, to keep the night air from doing whatever damage the night air was thought capable of doing. The night air was not trusted. Medieval medicine understood disease imperfectly, and one of the mechanisms it attributed to illness was the action of bad air, the miasmatic theory that certain conditions in the air could cause sickness to enter the body through the breath. This was wrong in its mechanism, but it encoded a genuine epidemiological observation that some environments were more dangerous than others, that moisture and cold and decaying organic matter were associated with illness. The practical response, to seal the sleeping space, to use fragrant herbs to avoid damp and cold, was not ineffective even if the reasoning behind it was incorrect. Prayers were said before sleep, not only out of religious obligation, though that obligation was real and taken seriously, but also because the act of prayer before sleep served a psychological function that we would now describe in terms of anxiety reduction and the preparation of the mind for rest. A person who had completed the ritual of evening prayer, who had performed the sequence of words and gestures that marked the boundary between wakefulness and sleep, was better prepared for sleep than one who had not. The medieval mind did not make the distinction between physical and psychological warmth that we would now draw. Warmth was warmth. Whatever produced it was part of the system. Small iron objects, placed under the pillow or beneath the bed. Crosses scratched into the plaster above the sleeping space. The name of a saint whispered before the curtains were drawn. These practices mixed what we would call superstition with what we would call religion, and neither category quite captures what they actually were, which was the accumulated wisdom of generations about what helped people face the long cold night with enough equanimity to actually sleep through it. Let us talk about the winter nights themselves, because the cold was not constant across the season. The medieval year moved through cold in a pattern that everyone who lived through it understood the way a farmer understands the land. The first cold of autumn, arriving in October, was manageable. The household was still warm from summer, the stores were full, the firewood was freshly cut and stacked. The November cold was harder, the days shorter, the necessity of fire becoming urgent rather than merely desirable. December and January were the worst months, and this was when all the strategies of warmth came into their fullest deployment. The household contracted. People spent more time in fewer rooms. The chambers that were not occupied were not heated, because fuel was expensive and there was no point warming a space where no one was sleeping. The occupied rooms were kept as warm as they could be managed, and the sleeping arrangements within them were as tightly organized as the space allowed. February was the hunger month as well as the cold month, the time when the harvest stores were running low, when the fuel pile had been depleted through months of burning, when the cold was still absolute but the resources for fighting it were diminishing. Medieval accounts from February have a quality that is distinguishable from those of earlier winter months, a quality of endurance and calculation, of stretching what remained as far as it would go. March brought the first possibility of relief, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of warmth, the return of sunlight at angles that actually did something useful. The lengthening of days that meant less of the day had to be spent in darkness and cold. The emotional significance of the first genuinely warm day of spring was not lost on people who had spent 4 months fighting the cold with everything they had. Medieval accounts of the first spring warmth have a quality of relief that feels almost physical to read. But we are not there yet. We are still in the castle, in winter, in the dark, and there is more to understand about how the night was survived. The children slept close to the adults. This was not primarily a matter of sentiment, though sentiment certainly played its part in the warmth that parents felt for their children. Children are physiologically more vulnerable to cold than adults. Their smaller bodies have a higher surface area relative to their volume, which means they lose heat more quickly than adults do. They have less metabolic reserve. They cannot maintain their body temperature as effectively against a persistent cold environment. Keeping children in close physical proximity to adults through the night was, in the cold conditions of a medieval castle, a genuine survival strategy. A child sleeping alone in a cold chamber, under whatever blankets were available, faced a meaningfully greater thermal challenge than a child sleeping beside an adult whose body continuously produced warmth. Medieval parents understood this through observation and experience, even without the physiological explanation. The elderly faced comparable vulnerability for different reasons. Older bodies are less efficient at generating and retaining heat. The circulation becomes less effective, meaning that extremities chill faster and take longer to warm. The metabolic rate is lower, meaning that less heat is produced from the same caloric input. Elderly people in a medieval castle were deliberately placed in the warmer positions available, nearest the fire, closest to the center of the sleeping group, given the most blankets. This was not always possible and not always achieved, and the winter death toll among elderly people in cold medieval buildings was real and significant. But the intention was there, and the accommodations were made when they could be. There was another kind of warmth that the medieval castle provided that does not fit neatly into any of the practical categories we have been discussing, and it was not a small thing. The warmth of company. In the long cold evenings before sleep, in the hour between the evening meal and the time when the household retired, people gathered. They gathered in the great hall around the fire that was still burning at something approaching full strength. They talked, they told stories, they sang in households where music was part of the regular evening life. They played games. They conducted the minor business of the household, the small negotiations and arrangements and conversations that kept a community of people functioning together. The social warmth of this gathering was not separate from the physical warmth. People sitting close together around a fire are sharing body heat as well as conversation. The sound of familiar voices in a dark, cold space has a physiological effect on the nervous system that we would now describe in terms of reduced cortisol levels and lowered anxiety response, which are also warmth-related effects because anxiety activates physiological cooling responses in the body. Medieval people did not have this vocabulary. They knew that sitting together in firelight before bed felt warmer than sitting alone, and they arranged their evenings accordingly. Storytelling was particularly important in this context. The long narrative stories that were a feature of medieval castle evenings, the romances and chronicles and saints' lives that were read aloud or recited from memory or improvised by skilled performers, served a function beyond entertainment. They occupied the mind with something other than cold. They created a shared imaginative space that was in some ways warmer than the physical one. A story well told made people forget, for a while, that their feet were cold and their breath was visible and the fire was already beginning to decline from its evening peak. The skill of the storyteller was valued in a medieval castle partly for exactly this reason. Someone who could hold a room's attention for 2 hours, carrying people through an imagined landscape of adventure or devotion or courtly love, was someone who was making the cold night shorter and the morning closer. That skill had practical value in an environment where the night was long and the cold was constant and the mind needed occupation to keep it from dwelling on discomfort. We should talk about what the servants experienced because their nights were genuinely different from those of their employers, and the difference is instructive. The lord and lady of a major castle had access to every element of the system we have been describing. The great bed with its curtains and canopy and multiple mattresses and layers of blankets and fur coverlet. The chamber fireplace, tended by designated servants. The bedtime drink of spiced wine. The sleeping cap of fine linen. The small dog at the foot of the bed. All of these resources combined to create a sleeping environment that, while cold by our standards, was genuinely managed and genuinely survivable in reasonable comfort. The servants had fewer of these resources and sometimes none of them. A servant sleeping on a pallet near the door of the Lord's chamber had access to whatever warmth leaked from the great bed and whatever remained in the fireplace as it banked toward morning. Their bedding was thinner and fewer layered. Their sleeping clothes were coarser and less effectively insulating. They had no curtained space to create a microclimate, no bed warmer to preheat their sleeping surface, no small dog to warm their feet. What they had was proximity to the room's occupants, which provided some thermal benefit. They had each other in the cases where servants slept in groups, and they had the general understanding that the Lord's chamber was, whatever its deficiencies, likely to be the warmest occupied room in the castle, which was why being assigned to sleep in it was considered a better position than being assigned to sleep in an unheated storeroom in the basement. In the lower levels of the castle hierarchy, the conditions were harder. Kitchen boys slept in or near the kitchen because it was warm. Stable hands slept in the stables because the horses kept the space above freezing. Guards on the walls slept in whatever shelter could be contrived, and on very cold nights the rotations became shorter because the cold became physiologically dangerous. The castle at night was not a single experience. It was many different experiences of the same cold, distributed unequally across the social hierarchy that occupied it. Let us slow down for a moment. You are still here, which means the night is doing its work. The cold is settling around you the way it always does, the way it settled around the people we have been talking about, patiently and persistently, finding every gap in the insulation, testing every edge of the warmth you have assembled around yourself. But you are warmer than they were. Your building is better sealed. Your heating system does not go out at midnight. Your blankets were made by machines with an understanding of thermal resistance that no medieval craftsperson could have had. The distance between your situation and theirs is real and significant. And yet, the fundamental experience of preparing for sleep in a cold environment, the layering of clothing and bedding, the gathering around the warmest available source of heat before making the crossing to the sleeping space, the checking of the fire, the drawing of whatever curtains or coverings are available, the positioning of the body in the nest of warmth you have assembled, the closing of the eyes against the dark, all of this is recognizable across the centuries. The specifics changed. The underlying activity is the same one that human beings have been performing since they first moved into stone buildings and discovered that stone is cold. The second half of the night is quieter than the first. The household is settled. The fires are banked. The great bed is curtained, and the sleeping space within it is as warm as it is going to be. The servants on their pallets have stopped shifting. The dogs have chosen their positions. The candles have burned down or been snuffed. The castle at the deepest hours of a winter night has a quality of silence that is different from any other silence. The stone amplifies certain sounds and absorbs others. The wind outside is audible, not as a roar, but as a low, sustained presence, a breath against the walls that never quite stops. The fire makes small noises as the logs settle and the embers shift. A horse in the stable range coughs once, and the sound travels through the building in a way that seems to make the silence deeper by contrast. Someone in the Lord's chamber is awake. This is the waking interval, the natural pause between the first sleep and the second. It might be the Lord himself, lying behind the drawn curtains in the warm dark, thinking the thoughts that come in this particular hour, half dream and half memory, and half something that has no clean name. It might be the servant whose job it is to tend the fire, rising quietly from the pallet, crossing the cold floor in stockinged feet, adding a log to the embers and watching it catch before returning to the thin warmth of their bedding. In the monastery across the valley, or the town a mile from the castle gates, the same waking is happening in different forms. The monastery bell is ringing for the night office. The monks are rising from their straw pallets in their cold dormitory, pulling their habits around them, filing in silence to the chapel where their breath will be visible in the candlelight and the stone floor will leach cold through the soles of their sandals as they stand through the ancient prayers. They will return to their beds after an hour, and the second sleep will come, and the cold will have been managed for another night. Morning arrives slowly in winter. The light does not burst through the windows. It seeps, grey and tentative, through whatever gaps exist in the shutters, spreading across the stone floor in pale sheets that look almost warm but provide no heat at all. The fires have been burning for an hour already, the servants having risen before the household to ensure that the chambers were at least approaching tolerable before the lord and lady emerged from the warmth of the great bed. The water in the basin has a thin skin of ice across it that must be broken before washing. The floor is cold enough through the rushes that you can feel it through your stockings. The air in the chamber is still cold, though not as cold as it was at midnight, warmed slightly by the revived fire and by the gradual accumulation of body heat from the people and animals who have been sleeping in the space through the night. You get dressed while still sitting on the bed, staying within the thermal envelope of the curtained space as long as possible before committing to the cold room. You put on more clothes than you wore yesterday because the cold of a winter morning demands it. You move to the fire, which is now burning properly again. and you stand close to it and let it work on your hands and your face while the rest of your body warms more slowly through the layers of clothing. The household begins to move. The sounds of the castle waking filter through the stone, distorted and amplified in the way that stone handles sound. Footsteps on the staircase, a door somewhere below, voices in the courtyard, the smell of wood smoke intensifying as more fires are lit in more rooms, the kitchen fireplace, which never went fully cold, being built up for the day's cooking. This is morning in a medieval castle in winter. This is the other side of the night you have just lived through. The cold is still present. It will be present all day, retreating somewhat as the building warms from all the fires burning within it, advancing again as the sun declines and the afternoon tips toward evening and the whole process begins again. The people who lived through this, season after season, year after year, were not heroic in any dramatic sense. They were practical. They understood their environment and they worked with it, using everything available to them, layering solution upon solution until the combination was enough to see them through. They were cold, they were sometimes very cold, but they survived, and in surviving they developed a body of practical knowledge about warmth and insulation and thermal management that, if you strip away the specific technologies and look at the underlying principles, maps onto what we know today with surprising accuracy. The season turns eventually. It always does. The first day in late February or early March, when the sun is at a different angle and the stone of the south wall is actually warm to the touch at midday. The first morning when the water in the basin is not frozen. The first evening when the fire in the chamber feels optional rather than necessary. These moments were noticed. They were felt in the body before they were recorded in words. The medieval castle did not transform overnight from a cold place into a warm one. The stone took weeks to release the cold it had accumulated through the winter, and the nights stayed chilly long after the days had become genuinely pleasant. But the trajectory had changed. The long siege of winter was ending. The household began gradually to relax the tight defensive posture it had held through the dark months. Blankets were aired outside for the first time. Shutters were opened during the day to admit the returning light. The evening gathering by the fire became less urgent, less a strategy and more a pleasure. The pre-sleep drink was still taken, the fire still tended, the bed curtains still drawn. But the tension that had run through all of it, the sense of a system that must be maintained carefully or the consequences would be serious, that tension began to ease. Spring in a medieval castle was not a dramatic event. It was a gradual withdrawal of cold, a slow return of colour and sound and warmth to a world that had been stripped down to its essentials for months. And the people who had managed those months, who had survived the cold with their ingenuity and their layered strategies and their practical understanding of how heat worked and how to hold on to it, felt what everyone feels after surviving something difficult. Grateful, relieved, and perhaps in the way that only people who have really been cold can understand, genuinely, unreservedly warm. Tonight, lying in whatever warmth your own bed provides, in whatever building shelters you from whatever the weather is doing outside your window right now, you are connected to something long and continuous. The human project of making nights survivable in cold places is as old as permanent buildings themselves. Every adaptation we have discussed tonight, every curtain and canopy and sleeping cap and heated stone, was part of a conversation between people and their environment that has never really ended. The technologies changed, the understanding deepened, the comfort improved enormously, but the fundamental activity, the gathering of warmth before sleep, the construction of the nest, the letting go of the day into whatever the night will bring, that is unchanged. The castle walls are still standing somewhere. Cold still in the way that stone is always cold, accumulating the temperature of the surrounding air and giving it back slowly and patiently. The fires are gone. The tapestries are in museums. The beds have been dismantled, their great carved posts separated from their curtains and their canopies, their feather mattresses long since dissolved into history. But the night is still the same night. The dark is the same dark. And sleep, when it comes, is still the same grace. Let your thoughts drift now. Let the story of the castle and the cold settle into somewhere below conscious attention, becoming background rather than foreground. The fire is banking, the curtains are drawn, the night is doing what nights have always done, moving through its hours with the patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time. Someone is tending the embers, someone has the dogs at their feet, someone is warm enough for now, and the second sleep is coming. Let it come. Good night.